What's happening, Sonic Scientists? Trumpeter and composer Bobby Spellman here to welcome you to the second episode in our series on the Lydian chromatic concept of tonal organization. This episode is going to be a little unusual for a music theory video, but before we dive into the depths of the concept, I thought it would be important to provide a little background on the way that we might choose to view the Lydian chromatic concept as it relates to our conventional approach to music theory, using the principles of, you guessed it, the philosophy of science. So strap in, theory nerds, and join me on a circuitous philosophical adventure on this exciting episode of Theory with Bob. I've been pretty heavily involved in music since about the day I escaped the womb. But in the days before I decided to commit to studying music formally at New England Conservatory, I got a degree in philosophy from Ithaca College. In my time as a philosophy student, one of the subjects that was most fascinating to me was the philosophy of science. I took a great class with a great philosophy professor, Bob Klee, and Bob Klee introduced us to one of the great works in the philosophy of science, Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Thomas Kuhn studied the history of science before publishing the first edition of his now famous book in 1962. Thomas Kuhn's view of the way that science progresses through time influenced the way that we now think about the philosophy and history of science, and it certainly had a big impact on the way that I came to view the Lydian chromatic concept as it relates to the history of music theory and other approaches to music theory. So now, for your education and entertainment, I will do my very best to try to summarize Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions in a very short period of time and give you a little bit of an idea of the way that this gave me some insight into the way that we can think about the Lydian chromatic concept. All right, so what is the Structure of Scientific Revolutions all about? Well, it's easy for us to imagine the advancement of scientific knowledge through time as being basically a linear progression in which the day-to-day experiments and observations of the scientific community allow us to gradually increase our knowledge about the world around us, always adding new information to the pool of knowledge that we already have. However, in studying the history of philosophy, Thomas Kuhn came to the conclusion that what we really have as a model for the history of science and the way that scientific knowledge progresses through time is a little bit more complicated. Thomas Kuhn argued that we start off with prolonged periods of fairly tedious day-to-day scientific work, things like basic experimentations and observations of the natural world, that Thomas Kuhn called normal science. Then these periods of normal science are sporadically interrupted by fairly dramatic revolutions in the very foundation of the way that we view different scientific fields that Thomas Kuhn called paradigm shifts. In fact, Thomas Kuhn really coined the term paradigm as we know it today to mean the theories and procedures and basic fundamental groundwork for how we understand a particular scientific field. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but I'll take you through the sort of life cycle of a particular paradigm. So what we start off with is the day-to-day activity of normal science, in which scientists go to work doing experiments and observing the natural world in order to better understand the world that we know it based on the underlying set of beliefs that they're working from. Over time, day-to-day work in science can reveal certain anomalies that perhaps challenge the underlying belief system. Usually those are basically ignored, but over time, if there are sufficient anomalies to start to discredit the underlying view of the way that the world works, this can set the scientific community in a particular field into a state of crisis. At that point, there are some new kinds of experiments being done in the field in order to try to remedy these anomalies. And over time, this extraordinary science, as Thomas Kuhn puts it, will lead to a number of competing paradigms. And those paradigms, once again, that meaning the sort of underlying theory on which the rest of the scientific field is based. So over time, one or another of those paradigms may win out, and that will be a revolution in scientific thought, which will reshape the way that a particular field thinks about the underlying theory or procedures of a particular field. And the process of normal science will begin anew based on this new paradigm. So to clarify this a little bit and give a good example of a paradigm through time, we can look to the Ptolemaic versus the Copernican view of the universe or the solar system or the cosmos. All right, so before Nicholas Copernicus came on the scene in the 1500s, scientists were operating under the geocentric model of the universe that was established by Claudius Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD. So, for many hundreds of years, the astronomers of the time were under the impression that the Earth was the center of the universe and all the other celestial bodies were spinning around the Earth. In the 1500s, Copernicus came along and came up with a theory in which the sun was the center of the solar system and the Earth, like other planets, were revolving around the sun. Now, this heliocentric view of the solar system seems obvious to us now, but at the time, Copernicus's theory, even though mathematically more elegant, wasn't better at explaining or predicting the position of the planets and stars in our sky than the Ptolemaic model. So for many years, even though Copernicus had in theory come up with the right answer to the position of the Earth versus the sun in the cosmos, the scientific community was still not convinced of the new theory. It was only in the 1600s when Galileo developed some better technology, some better telescopes for viewing the night sky, that he could start to see that, for example, Jupiter had moons and Venus had phases like our own moon. Now, these were in opposition to the Ptolemaic model of the universe, and so for that reason, these were anomalies that had to be accounted for. It was only later when Isaac Newton came up with his laws of gravity and laws of motion that finally the Ptolemaic model was replaced as the dominant paradigm by the Copernican heliocentric model of the solar system. Now, Copernicus certainly wasn't right about everything, but by establishing the heliocentric view of the solar system as the dominant paradigm in astronomy, the regular work of day-to-day science could continue on to try to refine and better understand that paradigm and better understand the world around us. The Copernican revolution is a very good example of a paradigm shift because even though Copernicus was more accurate in terms of his understanding of the position of the Earth in the solar system, his model did not necessarily prove to be a better model at predicting the position of the planets and stars in the night sky until much later. All it did was really give us a different perspective from which to view those subjects that had already been studied in astronomy. It was only later when we started having a better understanding of the nature of the universe and a better ability to observe the celestial bodies that it was clear that Copernicus's heliocentric view was a better model and a better way to understand the universe around us. Another great example of a paradigm shift is the move from Newtonian physics to Einstein's general theory of relativity. Now, if I throw a baseball out of the window, it's going to fall to the Earth at 9.8 meters per second squared, whether we think of that as being the Earth's gravitational pull on the baseball or whether we think of it as the bending of space-time. Ultimately, the underlying theories and procedures that make up the fundamental paradigm in a field really give us a particular perspective on which to view or from which to view the natural world around us and the phenomena that we experience. Now, this can be very important because certain paradigms may win out over others because of their ability to explain things that would otherwise be inexplicable anomalies in other paradigms. So, ideally, the best paradigm wins out over the other paradigms, and then that becomes the dominant fundamental theory in a particular scientific field. From that point, the scientific community goes back to the regular, sometimes tedious, day-to-day activity of normal science, refining the paradigm and understanding increasingly the world around us. All right, so I leave philosophy school and return to my hometown of Boston, Massachusetts, to pursue a master's degree in jazz trumpet performance from New England Conservatory. While I was there, I decided to enroll in a class with Professor Ben Schwendener on the Lydian chromatic concept. I'd heard tale of the Lydian chromatic concept from older musicians, as well as from the liner notes from Kind of Blue, and I knew it would be an interesting class to take because NEC was really one of the only schools that offered that, as George Russell taught at NEC for many, many years. Now, at the time and to this day, Ben Schwendener remains the world's leading authority on the Lydian chromatic concept ever since the passing of George Russell in 2009. And it was a great opportunity to study the theory, although being naturally skeptical, at first I was pretty unsure about the value of the principles of the Lydian chromatic concept. However, as I continued to study the theory in Ben Schwendener's class, a lot of parallels started to emerge in my mind between the philosophy of science and the structure of scientific revolutions and what George Russell was trying to do with the Lydian chromatic concept. So let me give you a couple of ideas of the way that these two ideas were sort of connected in my mind. Up until the beginning of the 20th century, when jazz improvisation really took off, most of the people in the music world who were doing what we might relate to as normal science were a fairly small group of composers and theorists. However, with the advent of jazz improvisation in Western music, now we had a lot of people who are all spontaneous composers, all working on ways of relating scales to chords. Now, this created, in my mind, a sort of situation in which all of these jazz musicians were out there conducting a sort of normal science of their own, relating these scales to chords in this spontaneous kind of harmonic dance. So, in the process of really trying to create music in 1 minute, 1 minute's music in 1 minute's time, a lot of anomalies or sort of unexplained facets of the music started to emerge from the way that we view music theory. So, for example, the anomaly that particularly troubled George Russell was the one that we could perhaps call the avoid note problem, which is the fact that the 4 of the major scale sounds fairly dissonant over the related major chord. So the F in C major sounds kind of unusually dissonant on a C major chord. Now, George Russell was trying to solve that problem, and we as jazz musicians have to find a way to deal with that and a way to communicate about it. But the goal of the Lydian chromatic concept at first was to try to resolve that anomaly. Now, a couple of other things that occur to me as anomalies in conventional music theory include the fact that the blues scale, which is based on a minor pentatonic scale, still sounds good over major harmony. That seems sort of unexplained by conventional music theory. Another idea that I think really comes up now in modern jazz is the fact that in our post-1960s, post-Woody Shaw, post-Eric Dolphy world, it's very common to play inside and outside of the changes. But conventional music theory, as we learn it, doesn't really have a good explanation for the difference between inside playing and outside playing, other than to say that if you're playing out, you're playing a bunch of wrong notes, and it's just about trying to make wrong notes sound good. However, the principles of the Lydian chromatic concept I found over time really well illustrated what was going on playing from inside to outside. Now, the Lydian chromatic concept can be used just as easily to explain Bach's music and all the classical music in our sort of Western musical canon as it does to explain things like 12-tone music or Ornette Coleman's music or Woody Shaw's music or the music from different cultures throughout the world that may not, from first glance, appear to be in line with the way that we operate in the standard scales in Western music. So over time, I started to notice these elements of Lydian chromatic concept that were able to explain these things that otherwise seemed to me sort of anomalous in the way that I was taught music theory from the beginning. Another example is I was taking a lesson once with Jerry Bergonzi, great saxophone player. I studied with him for a year at New England Conservatory, and in one of our lessons, he said to me, he said, you can just play the sharp 5 over the major chord. And I said, oh yeah, that's the Lydian chromatic concept. And he was like, oh, I don't know anything about that. To him, it was just working it out, and that's fine. But all of a sudden, it occurred to me, oh, well, this is something that is explained in the context of the Lydian chromatic concept. So I became much more interested in the principles of the theory because I felt as though it may have a better ability to explain some of the more advanced harmonic approaches that I had been used to listening to and being a part of since my youth in the sort of greater Boston jazz scene. So from there, I decided to study privately with Ben Schwendinger. I studied with him for the years that I was at New England Conservatory, as well as several years afterwards. And I did my very best to try to understand the whole breadth and depth of the Lydian chromatic concept and try to apply some of the principles from the philosophy of science to the Lydian chromatic concept. There's one more principle from the philosophy of science that had a big impact on the way that I began to examine George Russell's theory of music. And it goes like this. The great philosopher of science, Karl Popper, devised a standard for the verification of various hypotheses and theories in science that he called falsification. Falsification has basically two parts to it. On the one hand, Karl Popper would use the principle of falsification to differentiate between legitimate pursuits in scientific knowledge and pseudoscience. And it goes like this. If you're dealing with a hypothesis in a particular field that has some legitimate merit to it, you should be able to find a logical way in which certain empirical evidence would theoretically be able to prove the hypothesis wrong. If you have something in which no empirical evidence would be able to prove that hypothesis wrong, you are dealing with pseudoscience. So, for example, the example that Karl Popper used was if we were to say the statement, all swans are white, that is a statement that is falsifiable because all you would need to do is find the existence of one black swan. However, it would be very difficult to observe every swan and then decide that none of them are black. All you would have to do, or to say that all of them are white, all you would have to do is to find one non-white swan, and that concept would falsify the hypothesis. Now, it may be that there is no actual circumstance in which it is falsified, but the logical ability to falsify it with some kind of hypothetical empirical evidence is enough to prove that it is a legitimate field of science. Now, this is in opposition to something, for example, like astrology, let's say. Sorry to upset all the astrologers out there. But if I look at my whatever it is, my chart, and it says that tomorrow is going to do X, Y, and Z, or I'm such and such a thing, you can't say, well, that's not true, so therefore astrology. Astrology doesn't have the same, standards of falsification. Thus, Karl Popper may put that in the field of pseudoscience, for example. Now, the other thing about falsification is that in order to verify a hypothesis or a theory in science, Karl Popper didn't think it was possible, as with the swan example, to observe every possible. You can't do a million, infinite experiments to prove the veracity of a particular hypothesis. So the best way to do it is to put the hypothesis through many tests in an attempt to falsify the underlying hypothesis. So with that in mind, over the next couple of years studying with Professor Ben Schwendinger and beyond, I started to write a lot of pieces of music with the intent of trying to falsify elements of George Russell's Lydian chromatic concept. And in the process of doing so, I learned a lot about the parameters of the concept, and there are certain instances in which I found there may be a better way of looking at or refining the Lydian chromatic concept, or looking at it in a slightly different way, which I will talk about in future videos. But all in all, that was my procedure. All right, so that brings us to this very video right now. And my job in creating this video series is to give some more information on the Lydian chromatic concept for the express reason that the more people who are interested in it and involved in it and are using the principles, the more we can try to refine these ideas and try, in some ways, to falsify it. And if we can falsify it and find out that some element of this doesn't work, perhaps a new paradigm can spring anew from the underlying views that the Lydian chromatic concept provides that may be better perspectives from which to view some of the more advanced harmonic approaches that have emerged in jazz and improvised music since the 60s. So my hope in doing this video series is to, really outline some of the interesting components of George Russell's theory, and as well try to figure out where his hypotheses may fall short. Now, there's two more points I want to make before the end of this now getting to be very long video. Thanks for sticking with me, gang. We're having fun, aren't we? Woo! We're going to have some fun on these next couple of videos, I'll tell you what. A couple things. Number one, music theory is not an empirical science. It's not the same as astronomy. It's not the same as astronomy. It's not the same as the physical sciences because it's wrapped up very much in human culture, which brings with it certain aesthetic choices that differ between various cultures and times. So by no means am I suggesting that the Lydian chromatic concept is some sort of strictly scientific view of the nature of the way that music works. However, there is a lot of the physics of sound and the observational components of dissonance in certain harmonic contexts that are involved, and I do think that those principles are falsifiable. I think there are certain things in the Lydian chromatic concept that are logically falsifiable, and whether or not they are falsified will be up to us in the future. So I'm just saying, it's not science, but a lot of the concepts that I noticed in the philosophy of science seem to really work parallel to these kinds of principles in the Lydian chromatic concept, and all of this philosophy of science really gave me a particular perspective on the way that the Lydian chromatic concept might be viewed. So with that out of the way, the last thing that I'll say is that all of this that I've learned about the Lydian chromatic concept, I learned from the great Ben Schwenninger, who has been a very great teacher and a great friend to me. So I just want to say, he's the leading authority on this, and he really had a big influence on the way that I think about these things. So props to him. Huge shout out to Ben for being a great guy and for really having a very curious and open-minded approach to a lot of the stuff and being able to convey it in a way that is really profound. All right, so without further ado, that brings us to the principles of the Lydian chromatic concept, which I will cover in the next couple of videos. That's enough philosophy for now, gang. But thanks for coming with me on the journey. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any more questions about this, leave them in the comments. I'm going to do a whole video answering any questions that that you have out there. So if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Like any questions that you see that you're interested in me answering, and I will try to get to all of them later. If you like this video, give us a like and subscribe to the channel. This will be the last strict philosophy episode I do for a little while, but I hope you got something out of it. And I hope you have a fun time doing various experiments in music theory and in improvisation, and I'll catch you on the next one. See ya. Theory with Bob. All right, gang, thanks so much for checking out this video. We hope it helps in your quest for the majesty of musical self-expression. The Ridgewood School of Music is currently accepting new students for lessons online or in person in the Brooklyn, Queens, and New York City area. If you'd like us to help set you up with the perfect teacher for the instrument or style that you're interested in studying, you can find us on our website at www.ridgewoodschoolofmusic.com, or you can shoot us an email at ridgewoodschoolofmusic@gmail.com. If you enjoyed this video and you would like to support the creation of new videos like this one, you can find us on our Patreon at patreon.com/Ridgewood School of Music. There, as a subscriber to the Patreon, you can gain access to bonus content, including bonus videos, exercises in improvisation and different instruments, as well as bonus transcription videos. So, if you'd like to help support the creation of new videos like this one, find us on our Patreon, and it's a real big help. All right, gang, have a wonderful time practicing, and we'll catch you on the next one. See ya.